Hello there, everyone. Today we are going to be going over what makes a starting pitcher effective and going through a couple examples of who that might be. So, to start with here, I'm just going to open up Wade Miley. We're going to talk a little bit about what we see here. So, first of all, we got a pitcher who's not a very high overall, so he's not going to be a super high quality starter per se. But what he does have going for him is good stamina and hold runners. He's got some strong movement. His control's not too bad, and his stuff isn't awful, but it's not great. So ultimately, what we're looking at here, however, is a starting pitcher that can be very effective in OOTP. So what is it that makes a starting pitcher effective in the first place? I'm not talking about really good, a top tier starting pitcher. I'm talking about effective, a pitcher who can get the job done, maybe like a 3.5 to 4 ERA guy, someone who can fill the back of your rotation at a cheap price and do very well in that role. So, first thing we're going to see and talk about here is that Wade Miley has a lot of pitches. He's got 5 of them. For starting pitchers in the back of your rotation, having more pitches is better. Each pitch provides a pitcher with some kind of bonus that's going to help them out, be it better strikeout rates or reducing their splits or decreasing home run rates. Some of them will decrease your walk rate a little bit, but ultimately it's good to have a lot of pitches. It'll also help boost your stuff and keep you more stable, especially on the lower end of pitchers. It's going to be a nice booster and keep you steady overall. Next thing that he's got going for him is solid control. Control, first of all, not only reduces your walk rate, but also reduces your pitches per plate appearance, which is a very significant statistic for all of your starting pitchers. The lower that is, the more innings your pitchers are going. Also, obviously, reducing your walk rate is going to keep guys off the base paths and make your pitcher more effective. The next thing that's going to make a pitcher quite effective is high movement. Now, especially in OOTP 23, where we see that home run rates are more important and movement and power are more influential on how that's going to come about. Having good movement is really important to making sure that you're not giving up large bunches of runs or guaranteed runs and solo home runs or whatever it may be. Ultimately, it's just very important to try to get that up, reduce the number of guaranteed runs, reduce your home run total, and get more balls in play, which will be something that we'll discuss in a little bit as well. Now, decent stamina is also quite important to an effective starting pitcher. For one thing, the more stamina you have, the more effective you're going to be deeper into your starts, which is really important. You can't have pitchers obviously just coming out at like 60 pitches, which would be technically the ideal place to pull some of the lower stamina pitchers. But if you're strapped for innings pitched, having a guy like Wade Miley with 65 stamina, that's a big deal. He's going to be able to go deep into games. He's going to be effective deeper than guys with lower stamina. And ultimately, that's going to allow him to give your team more value overall in that back of the rotation role, saving your relievers for different, more opportune times, perhaps, or later in the game where they'll be able to make a bigger impact. Now, the next thing that's really important is to have a strong defense behind your pitchers. Guys like Wade Miley can have significantly different results with a bad defense playing for them and a good defense playing for them. I would imagine that Wade Miley could probably have pretty reliably like a 3.75 ERA if you've got a solid shortstop, a solid center fielder, somebody who's going to be able to track down balls and make outs. But if you're playing somebody who's got much lower range and you're sacrificing for offense, for example, then you're going to have a much harder time having him be successful. You might have his ERA spike up a whole half run to 4.25 or even worse, which is obviously something you want to avoid. Keeping your earned runs down is a big deal. So if you're going to have the best way to build a cheap, successful team in OTP has always been to pick up guys like Wade Miley and build a strong defense behind them. You're going to get low run totals every time, and it's going to be a reliable way to win games. You pick up a couple of cheap hitters with that, you're pretty much guaranteed to make the playoffs, and that is still true, and even with the changes in 23, so it is obviously very valuable to have a good defense, especially for pitchers like that. And obviously, it's nice to have a good bullpen to back your guys up as well. If you just have bodies in your rotation, and keep in mind, starting pitchers are a lot cheap, or a lot more expensive and a lot harder to get than relief pitchers. So if you just fill your rotation with guys like Wade Miley, who are effective but not elite, and then you lock it down with your relief guys, your bullpen, you have like 4 or 5 dominant stopper type pitchers, then you're still going to have a really low run total against, and it might be a lot cheaper to do that. So that is a viable strategy in OOTP. Having a strong bullpen can really help you lock down and win games. Now, I want to talk about a couple of guys on this list, and this is just sorted by guys with 60 or more movement, 55 or more control, and 3 stars overall or lower, so not elite players per se. But Zach Neal, who's actually one of the worst rated guys on this list, and there's another Rocky coming up as well. This is one of the better pitchers of this type of build that you will find. A guy on a minor league contract. He's only 2 stars overall. He's got good stamina. He's got outstanding movement and control. His stuff's not too low. If you're looking for somebody to fill your bull or the back of your rotation cheaply and really well, Zach Neal is probably one of your go-to guys. He's going to be next to nothing, I'd imagine, to pick up from the Rockies on a minor league contract for their AAA team. He's not even in the majors. They're not giving him the respect he deserves. But you get a good defense behind this guy, and he's going to be maybe like a 3.5 ERA dude. He's better than Wade Miley, even, if you get a good defense. Now, next up is Antonio Cenzatella. This is a pitcher who's on a long-term contract, one that might even be viewed unfavorably by the Rockies, who may not use him effectively. He's like Wade Miley, but even better with that movement and control. At 65 and 60 respectively. He's got 4 pitches. He can really help out your team, so picking him up might not be a bad idea either, especially with as cheap as he could be. And then we got Dallas Keuchel. Now, the big problem with Dallas Keuchel is that he's a borderline star, which I'll get to later, but he's got really high movement. His control's not too bad. He's got 4 pitches. His stuff isn't even that bad. He's an extreme ground baller, ultimately. He's expensive, so you could take on his contract, maybe get some pretty solid players as compensation for doing so. And he's not a bad guy in the back of your rotation if you really need somebody. Now, the best players from this build are going to be guys like Sixto Sanchez, guys who have higher velocity, solid stuff. And not only do they have that good control and movement, but they round it out with strong stuff to go with it. Guys like Sixto Sanchez are going to be your ideal middle to upper rotation starters because, I mean, he's still not really going to be that expensive, I'd imagine, only being a 3-star potential player, although he obviously has the talent to be a very, very good pitcher. And I'd imagine Marcus Stroman's in a similar build. Yeah, he is a 5-pitch guy, strong stuff, movement and control. He's expensive once again, but a really good pitcher nonetheless. It might be a guy you could be interested in targeting if you're looking for someone really good. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is drop the filters and talk about the best pitchers in baseball. So what is it that makes a pitcher an ace, a dominant guy that you want at the top of your rotation? Well, we're going to start out here by looking at the best of the best, Corbin Burns, who in my book is the best pitcher in the major leagues right now, or at least he was in 2021, and is one of the better pitchers in 2022 as well. So what is it that Corbin Burns has going for him? He's still got a lot of pitches, 5 pitches, 80 stuff, 70 movement, 55 control. He's got really strong stamina. He throws hard. He's a ground baller. So what can we take from this that makes him so good? Well, first of all, he's got high velocity and wipeout pitches. Those are the 2 big things that you're going to look for in an ace that separate them from your mid-rotation guys. It's especially important to get higher strikeout pitches like the slider, which Corbin Burns has. That'll really help you capitalize on your strikeout tools. Other pitches like the forkball and the knuckle curveball that can lead to higher strikeout rates than others are also really nice to have. But ultimately, you don't really need them. They're just an extra boost to that strikeout rate. Once you have pitchers who are not giving up too many home runs or walks, really the next big thing is to prevent those balls in play. Make sure you just guarantee yourself an out, and the strikeout does that. It's the best way to ensure success with a starting pitcher to make them truly the dominant class. The next thing he's got here is 70 movement. And that's a really big deal. High movement is extremely important, as I've said, in OOTP 23, and getting pitchers who can prevent home runs is just really, really important. Not to mention that it will be a very big deal. I mean, if all you're doing is walking players, you'll get a few guys on base, sure, which is what is going to happen to Corbin Burns. His control's good, but it's not elite, so he'll walk a few guys. But he's striking everyone out, so there isn't going to be any balls in play to move those guys around the bases. And his movement's high enough that it's unlikely he'll give up very many home runs. So ultimately, the guys that do get on base aren't going to be capitalized on. And that's exactly what we're looking at in these elite tier starting pitchers. Guys who have the stuff to prevent balls in play and guys who have the movement to prevent home runs. So you're just leaving guys stranded when they do get on base. Now, obviously, this is going to affect how effective you are overall, but it should also decrease the percentage of runners stranded, which is something that can help you increase your ERA even more than normal. Another thing that's quite important is decent control. Now, Corbin Burns has 55 control, which is pretty good, but if you look at somebody like, say, I can't really think of any examples, and there's a reason for that. If you get really good stuff and really good movement, it doesn't matter how good they are if your control is in the pits. If you're walking everybody, you're still going to allow runs in decent margins. Your pitches per plate appearance is going to be a mess. You're going to have a ridiculous number of batters per inning. It's going to be impossible for you to be pitching deep enough into games to be effective, and you're really not going to be that good anyways because of your high walk rate. Now, high stamina is nice to have with elite type starting pitchers like this, but the pitches per plate appearance is not going to be particularly high. So ultimately, you're still going to get enough innings for them to be effective, but you don't need these guys to eat innings like you might someone at the back of your rotation. If you have that stamina, that's a great bonus. You get more innings out of your elite starting pitchers, but really, they're here to be extremely effective, not necessarily pitching a lot as well. Now we're also going to take a quick look at Jacob deGrom, who is almost undoubtedly one of the best starting pitchers in baseball. You see once again the elite stuff. Now he only has 3 pitches, but because they're so strong and he's got that slider, it's not that big of a deal. It's also really nice and helps him out a lot that his movement and control are both really high. The control doesn't need to be this high for him to be a dominant pitcher. He would be just fine with 65 movement and 50 control. Still one of the best pitchers in baseball, but it certainly does help him out. The 70 stamina, also really nice. You're going to get even more innings out of your elite ace type pitcher. And yeah, so ultimately, those are the things that really factor into a very strong starting pitcher. Now, before I conclude the video, I also want to talk about what might make your pitcher less successful than you might think. And I've already covered a lot of these things, talking about why it's important for some things to be important or high for pitchers, but it's also nice to cover and look at why a pitcher might be less successful than you'd anticipate and understand what you can do to help them out or when it might be time to move on. First of all, control is way too low. And I just talked about this with wide dominant starting pitchers, although control isn't as important as it is for your bottom of the rotation guys. It's still important. If your control is too low, you're just not going to be able to record outs. Everyone's getting on base. Your pitches you're going to be throwing too many pitches. It's going to be it's the biggest way to mess up a pitcher, having incredibly low control. Now, something that can help with that is high catcher ability, guys, but that's not as powerful as it was last year. Last year, if your pitcher was good enough, you could maybe even make someone with fringy 30-35 control work out with an 80 catcher ability or similar guy if they were really dominant on the movement and stuff. But now, that's just not the case. 35 to 40 fringe is probably the absolute worst you can take for a starting pitcher. Now, maybe 35 for relievers, but that's a different story. We'll get into that another time. You really just want to stick with guys who have the prerequisite control to be successful, and then look at them as a whole when you're accounting for where their control is above that point. Now, movement being low can also absolutely wreck pitchers. No matter how effective you are, a home run is always a run. It doesn't matter how good your defense is behind you. It doesn't matter how many batters you strike out. If you allow a home run, you are allowing runs. If you allow a lot of home runs, you're allowing a whole lot of runs. And no matter how effective you are at preventing base runners, there's no way 100% of your home runs are solo shots. If your movement is 35 or 30, you're going to get absolutely decimated by the number of home runs you allow, which also, keep in mind, is a guaranteed not out, which means you have to pitch to more batters, which is also going to make you exhausted faster. You won't be able to go as deep. So it's important to have stronger movement to prevent those runs. And ultimately, I'd say 45 is probably the lowest movement I would be comfortable with, unless your park is very good at suppressing home runs. And even then, 40 movement is very sketchy. If you have really good control and really good stuff, maybe you can get away with pitching around a lot, but it's very questionable at best. You really want to make sure that your pitchers have good movement. There's very few cases where they can be successful without it. And it's also important that your pitcher is not pitching while tired. I recommend 100% of the time that you set a pitch when, or aggressive hook when fatigued, I believe is what it's called in your strategies. I'll just quickly pull this up on one of my players, and it's a very big deal to aggressive tiredness hook. Here it is. This means that when your pitchers get tired, they will stop pitching. They will be pulled from the game. This means that they are less likely to injure themselves. They're less likely to be ineffective towards the end of their starts. And yeah, those are really the two big things. But pitching while tired is one of the worst things that you can have going for your team. You want your players to be well rested at all times and make sure they're not playing when they aren't. You can see your ERA inflate significantly, and if you see pitchers giving up a lot of runs towards the ends of their outings, that's probably what the problem is. Another thing you can do, which I recommend, is to set your batter's face limit to a universal 27. You'll only go three times through the order, at which point the opposition will start getting better against you. I would also make sure that your pitchers are pitching, have some kind of a pitch count on your pitchers as well. That's less necessary with the aggressive tiredness hook, but it can still help, especially above 100 pitches in many cases, to keep your pitchers healthy and not getting blown up at the end of starts. Another thing that could be a problem, and this was the case with Dallas Keuchel, is if your suggested role is not starter. You need to make sure that whatever the recommended role is under a player is starter, not borderline starter, not emergency starter. It has to be a starting pitcher, or else they will receive a significant reduction to how effective they can be as a starting pitcher. I don't have specific numbers. I haven't tested this nearly enough, but the moment you pass that benchmark, the OOTP engine gives your pitcher a huge hit. It's almost not worth starting even a guy like Dallas Keuchel in the back of your rotation, just because of how significant that modifier is to a pitcher's effectiveness. Another thing that can really derail your pitchers is horrific defense. I'm always talking about how important it is to have good defense, but it's just as important to not have bad defense. If you're playing someone at shortstop who shouldn't even really be at second base or third base, you're going to have a really rough time with your starting pitching and your relief pitching for that matter. There will be a lot of hits on balls in play that shouldn't necessarily have been, and especially for the guys at the back of your rotation with more balls in play, that can really derail a pitcher's effectiveness. If your BABIP is going from ideally like the 270 to 280 range all the way up to 340, 330, that's a big deal. That can really lead to a lot more runs against you. It's also important to not have really high hit by pitch totals. Although this is incredibly rare, occasionally a pitcher will generate with really high hit by pitch totals, and this is one thing that you have to determine by statistics. You just go to a player's page. I'll once again rely on Zach Gallen for this. under pitching statistics. I believe it's an advanced statistic. I can't remember exactly which one. Should be HB or something like that, maybe. Anyways, you might be able to find it under the edit page as well. But either way, they can, in totals adding up, essentially they're equal to a walk. If you're hitting 20, 30 batters a season, which is incredibly rare, I'm just going to emphasize that, but it can be the case, then that's essentially like having 2 to 3 ticks less control, which is a big deal. It's going to be a problem. It also might be that you're intentionally hitting batters too often, which would also be a problem. But ultimately, the last thing, and this is the most common reason for a pitcher underperformance, is luck. There will always be season to season fluctuations in how your pitchers are going to perform, and your hitters, of course, as well. So if your pitcher just doesn't seem to be working out, it probably is just randomness going against them. Sometimes the most effective players to pick up are the ones who have horrible statistics, because if they've got good ratings, then the odds are in the future, and that's all that matters when you're evaluating players is future performance, they're going to be more productive than teams are valuing them. Anyways, guys, I hope this was helpful to you, and I will see you on the next video.